Chapter 17 Principal Causes Maintaining the Democratic Republic Part 3 Principal causes which render religion powerful in America: care taken by the Americans to separate the Church from the State; the laws, public opinion, and even the exertions of the clergy concur to promote this end; influence of religion upon the mind in the United States attributable to this cause; reason of this; what is the natural state of men with regard to religion at the present time; what are the peculiar and incidental causes which prevent men in certain countries from arriving at this state. The philosophers of the 18th century explained the gradual decay of religious faith in a very simple manner. Religious zeal, said they, must necessarily fail, the more generally liberty is established and knowledge diffused. Unfortunately, facts are by no means in accordance with their theory. There are certain populations in Europe whose unbelief is only equalled by their ignorance and their debasement, whilst in America one of the freest and most enlightened nations in the world fulfils all the outward duties of religious fervor. Upon my arrival in the United States, the religious aspect of the country was the first thing that struck my attention, and the longer I stayed there, the more did I perceive the great political consequences resulting from this state of things, to which I was unaccustomed. In France I had almost always seen the spirit of religion and the spirit of freedom pursuing courses diametrically opposed to each other; but in America I found that they were intimately united, and that they reigned in common over the same country. My desire to discover the causes of this phenomenon increased from day to day. In order to satisfy it, I questioned the members of all the different sects, and I more especially sought the society of the clergy, who are the depositaries of the different persuasions, and who are more especially interested in their duration. As a member of the Roman Catholic Church, I was more particularly brought into contact with several of its priests, with whom I became intimately acquainted. To each of these men I expressed my astonishment, and I explained my doubts. I found that they differed upon matters of detail alone, and that they mainly attributed the peaceful dominion of religion in their country to the separation of church and state. I do not hesitate to affirm that during my stay in America I did not meet with a single individual, of the clergy or of the laity, who was not of the same opinion upon this point. This led me to examine more attentively than I had hitherto done the station which the American clergy occupy in political society. I learned with surprise that they filled no public appointments. Not one of them is to be met with in the administration, and they are not even represented in the legislative assemblies. In several states the law excludes them from political life, public opinion in all. And when I came to inquire into the prevailing spirit of the clergy, I found that most of its members seemed to retire of their own accord from the exercise of power, and that they made it the pride of their profession to abstain from politics. I heard them inveigh against ambition and deceit, under whatever political opinions these vices might chance to lurk, but I learned from their discourses that men are not guilty in the eye of God for any opinions concerning political government which they may profess with sincerity, any more than they are for their mistakes in building a house or in driving a furrow. I perceived that these ministers of the gospel eschewed all parties with the anxiety attendant upon personal interest. These facts convinced me that what I had been told was true, and it then became my object to investigate their causes, and to inquire how it happened that the real authority of religion was increased by a state of things which diminished its apparent force. These causes did not long escape my researches. The short space of 60 years can never content the imagination of man, nor can the imperfect joys of this world satisfy his heart. Man alone of all created beings displays a natural contempt of existence, and yet a boundless desire to exist. He scorns life, but he dreads annihilation. These different feelings incessantly urge his soul to the contemplation of a future state, and religion directs his musings thither. Religion, then, is simply another form of hope, and it is no less natural to the human heart than hope itself. Men cannot abandon their religious faith without a kind of aberration of intellect and a sort of violent distortion of their true natures, but they are invincibly brought back to more pious sentiments, for unbelief is an accident, and faith is the only permanent state of mankind. If we only consider religious institutions in a purely human point of view, they may be said to derive an inexhaustible element of strength from man himself, since they belong to one of the constituent principles of human nature. I am aware that at certain times religion may strengthen this influence, which originates in itself by the artificial power of the laws, and by the support of those temporal institutions which direct society. Religions, intimately united to the governments of the earth, have been known to exercise a sovereign authority derived from the twofold source of terror and of faith. But when a religion contracts an alliance of this nature, I do not hesitate to affirm that it commits the same error as a man who should sacrifice his future to his present welfare, and in obtaining a power to which it has no claim, it risks that authority which is rightfully its own. When a religion founds its empire upon the desire of immortality which lives in every human heart, it may aspire to universal dominion. But when it connects itself with a government, it must necessarily adopt maxims which are only applicable to certain nations. Thus, in forming an alliance with a political power, religion augments its authority over a few, and forfeits the hope of reigning over all. As long as a religion rests upon those sentiments which are the consolation of all affliction, it may attract the affections of mankind. But if it be mixed up with the bitter passions of the world, it may be constrained to defend allies whom its interests and not the principle of love have given to it, or to repel as antagonists men who are still attached to its own spirit, however opposed they may be to the powers to which it is allied. The Church cannot share the temporal power of the State without being the object of a portion of that animosity which the latter excites. The political powers which seem to be most firmly established have frequently no better guarantee for their duration than the opinions of a generation, the interests of the time, or the life of an individual. A law may modify the social condition which seems to be most fixed and determinate, and with the social condition everything else must change. The powers of society are more or less fugitive. Like the years which we spend upon the earth, they succeed each other with rapidity, like the fleeting cares of life, and no government has ever yet been founded upon an invariable disposition of the human heart, or upon an imperishable interest. As long as a religion is sustained by those feelings, propensities, and passions which are found to occur under the same forms at all the different periods of history, it may defy the efforts of time, or at least it can only be destroyed by another religion. But when religion clings to the interests of the world, it becomes almost as fragile a thing as the powers of earth. It is the only one of them all which can hope for immortality, but if it be connected with their ephemeral authority, it shares their fortunes, and may fall with those transient passions which supported them for a day. The alliance which religion contracts with political powers must needs be onerous to itself, since it does not require their assistance to live, and by giving them its assistance it may be exposed to decay. The danger which I have just pointed out always exists, but it is not always equally visible. In some ages governments seem to be imperishable; in others the existence of society appears to be more precarious than the life of man. Some constitutions plunge the citizens into a lethargic somnolence, and others rouse them to feverish excitement. When governments appear to be so strong and laws so stable, men do not perceive the dangers which may accrue from a union of church and state. When governments display so much weakness, and laws so much inconstancy, the danger is self-evident, but it is no longer possible to avoid it. To be effectual, measures must be taken to discover its approach. In proportion as a nation assumes a democratic condition of society, and as communities display democratic propensities, it becomes more and more dangerous to connect religion with political institutions; for the time is coming when authority will be bandied from hand to hand, when political theories will succeed each other, and when men, laws, and constitutions will disappear or be modified from day to day, and this, not for a season only, but unceasingly. Agitation and mutability are inherent in the nature of democratic republics, just as stagnation and inertness are the law of absolute monarchies. If the Americans, who change the head of the government once in 4 years, who elect new legislators every 2 years, and renew the provincial officers every 12 months, if the Americans, who have abandoned the political world to the attempts of innovators, had not placed religion beyond their reach, where it could abide in the ebb and flow of human opinions, where would that respect which belongs to it be paid, amidst the struggles of faction? And what would become of its immortality in the midst of perpetual decay? The American clergy were the first to perceive this truth, and to act in conformity with it. They saw that they must renounce their religious influence if they were to strive for political power, and they chose to give up the support of the state rather than to share its vicissitudes. In America, religion is perhaps less powerful than it has been at certain periods in the history of certain peoples, but its influence is more lasting. It restricts itself to its own resources, but of those none can deprive it. Its circle is limited to certain principles, but those principles are entirely its own, and under its undisputed control. On every side in Europe we hear voices complaining of the absence of religious faith, and inquiring the means of restoring to religion some remnant of its pristine authority. It seems to me that we must first attentively consider what ought to be the natural state of man with regard to religion at the present time, and when we know what we have to hope and to fear, we may discern the end to which our efforts ought to be directed. The two great dangers which threaten the existence of religions are schism and indifference. In ages of fervent devotion, men sometimes abandon their religion, but they only shake it off in order to adopt another. Their faith changes the objects to which it is directed, but it suffers no decline. The old religion, then, excites enthusiastic attachment or bitter enmity in either party; some leave it with anger, others cling to it with increased devotedness, and although persuasions differ, irreligion is unknown. Such, however, is not the case when a religious belief is secretly undermined by doctrines which may be termed negative, since they deny the truth of one religion without affirming that of any other. Prodigious revolutions then take place in the human mind, without the apparent co-operation of the passions of man, and almost without his knowledge. Men lose the objects of their fondest hopes, as if through forgetfulness. They are carried away by an imperceptible current which they have not the courage to stem, but which they follow with regret, since it bears them from a faith they love, and to a scepticism that plunges them into despair. In ages which answer to this description, men desert their religious opinions from lukewarmness rather than from dislike. They do not reject them, but the sentiments by which they were once fostered disappear. But if the unbeliever does not admit religion to be true, he still considers it useful. Regarding religious institutions in a human point of view, he acknowledges their influence upon manners and legislation. He admits that they may serve to make men live in peace with one another, and to prepare them gently for the hour of death. He regrets the faith which he has lost, and as he is deprived of a treasure which he has learned to estimate at its full value, he scruples to take it from those who still possess it. On the other hand, those who continue to believe are not afraid openly to avow their faith. They look upon those who do not share their persuasion as more worthy of pity than of opposition, and they are aware that to acquire the esteem of the unbelieving they are not obliged to follow their example. They are hostile to no one in the world, and as they do not consider the society in which they live as an arena in which religion is bound to face its 1,000 deadly foes, they love their contemporaries, whilst they condemn their weaknesses and lament their errors. As those who do not believe conceal their incredulity, and as those who believe display their faith, public opinion pronounces itself in favor of religion. Love, support, and honor are bestowed upon it, and it is only by searching the human soul that we can detect the wounds which it has received. The mass of mankind, who are never without the feeling of religion, do not perceive anything at variance with the established faith. The instinctive desire of a future life brings the crowd before the altar, and opens the hearts of men to the precepts and consolations of religion. But this picture is not applicable to us, for there are men amongst us who have ceased to believe in Christianity without adopting any other religion, others who are in the perplexities of doubt, and who already affect not to believe, and others again who are afraid to avow that Christian faith which they still cherish in secret. Amidst these lukewarm partisans and ardent antagonists, a small number of believers exist who are ready to brave all obstacles and to scorn all dangers in defense of their faith. They have done violence to human weakness in order to rise superior to public opinion. Excited by the effort they have made, they scarcely knew where to stop, and as they know that the first use which the French made of independence was to attack religion, they look upon their contemporaries with dread, and they recoil in alarm from the liberty which their fellow citizens are seeking to obtain. As unbelief appears to them to be a novelty, they comprise all that is new in one indiscriminate animosity. They are at war with their age and country, and they look upon every opinion which is put forth there as the necessary enemy of the faith. Such is not the natural state of men with regard to religion at the present day, and some extraordinary or incidental cause must be at work in France to prevent the human mind from following its original propensities, and to drive it beyond the limits at which it ought naturally to stop. I am intimately convinced that this extraordinary and incidental cause is the close connection of politics and religion. The unbelievers of Europe attack the Christians as their political opponents rather than as their religious adversaries. They hate the Christian religion as the opinion of a party much more than as an error of belief, and they reject the clergy less because they are the representatives of the divinity than because they are the allies of authority. In Europe, Christianity has been intimately united to the powers of the earth. Those powers are now in decay, and it is, as it were, buried under their ruins. The living body of religion has been bound down to the dead corpse of superannuated polity. Cut but the bonds which restrain it, and that which is alive will rise once more. I know not what could restore the Christian Church of Europe to the energy of its earlier days. That power belongs to God alone, but it may be the effect of human policy to leave the faith in the full exercise of the strength which it still retains. How the instruction, the habits, and the practical experience of the Americans promote the success of their democratic institutions. What is to be understood by the instruction of the American people? The human mind more superficially instructed in the United States than Europe. No one completely uninstructed. Reason of this: rapidity with which opinions are diffused even in the uncultivated states of the West. Practical experience more serviceable to the Americans than book learning. I have but little to add to what I have already said concerning the influence which the instruction and the habits of the Americans exercise upon the maintenance of their political institutions. America has hitherto produced very few writers of distinction. It possesses no great historians, and not a single eminent poet. The inhabitants of that country look upon what are properly styled literary pursuits with a kind of disapprobation, and there are towns of very second-rate importance in Europe in which more literary works are annually published than in the 24 States of the Union put together. The spirit of the Americans is averse to general ideas, and it does not seek theoretical discoveries. Neither politics nor manufactures direct them to these occupations, and although new laws are perpetually enacted in the United States, no great writers have hitherto inquired into the general principles of their legislation. The Americans have lawyers and commentators, but no jurists, and they furnish examples rather than lessons to the world. The same observation applies to the mechanical arts. In America the inventions of Europe are adopted with sagacity. They are perfected and adapted with admirable skill to the wants of the country. Manufactures exist, but the science of manufacture is not cultivated, and they have good workmen but very few inventors. Fulton was obliged to proffer his services to foreign nations for a long time before he was able to devote them to his own country. The observer who is desirous of forming an opinion on the state of instruction amongst the Anglo-Americans must consider the same object from two different points of view. If he only singles out the learned, he will be astonished to find how rare they are. But if he counts the ignorant, the American people will appear to be the most enlightened community in the world. The whole population, as I observed in another place, is situated between these two extremes. In New England every citizen receives the elementary notions of human knowledge. He is moreover taught the doctrines and the evidences of his religion, the history of his country, and the leading features of its constitution. In the States of Connecticut and Massachusetts it is extremely rare to find a man imperfectly acquainted with all these things, and a person wholly ignorant of them is a sort of phenomenon. When I compare the Greek and Roman republics with these American States, the manuscript libraries of the former, and their rude population, with the innumerable journals and the enlightened people of the latter, when I remember all the attempts which are made to judge the modern republics by the assistance of those of antiquity, and to infer what will happen in our time from what took place 2000 years ago, I am tempted to burn my books in order to apply none but novel ideas to so novel a condition of society. What I have said of New England must not, however, be applied indistinctly to the whole Union. As we advance towards the west or the south, the instruction of the people diminishes. In the States which are adjacent to the Gulf of Mexico, a certain number of individuals may be found, as in our own countries, who are devoid of the rudiments of instruction. But there is not a single district in the United States sunk in complete ignorance, and for a very simple reason. The peoples of Europe started from the darkness of a barbarous condition to advance towards the light of civilization. Their progress has been unequal; some of them have improved apace, whilst others have loitered in their course, and some have stopped, and are still sleeping upon the way. Such has not been the case in the United States. The Anglo-Americans settled in a state of civilization upon that territory which their descendants occupy; they had not to begin to learn, and it was sufficient for them not to forget. Now the children of these same Americans are the persons who, year by year, transport their dwellings into the wilds, and with their dwellings their acquired information and their esteem for knowledge. Education has taught them the utility of instruction, and has enabled them to transmit that instruction to their posterity. In the United States society has no infancy, but it is born in man's estate. The Americans never use the word peasant, because they have no idea of the peculiar class which that term denotes. The ignorance of more remote ages, the simplicity of rural life, and the rusticity of the villager have not been preserved amongst them, and they are alike unacquainted with the virtues, the vices, the coarse habits, and the simple graces of an early stage of civilization. At the extreme borders of the Confederate States, upon the confines of society and of the wilderness, a population of bold adventurers have taken up their abode, who pierce the solitudes of the American woods and seek a country there, in order to escape that poverty which awaited them in their native provinces. As soon as the pioneer arrives upon the spot which is to serve him for a retreat, he fells a few trees and builds a log house. Nothing can offer a more miserable aspect than these isolated dwellings. The traveller who approaches one of them towards nightfall sees the flicker of the hearth flame through the chinks in the walls, and at night, if the wind rises, he hears the roof of boughs shake to and fro in the midst of their great forest trees. Who would not suppose that this poor hut is the asylum of rudeness and ignorance? Yet no sort of comparison can be drawn between the pioneer and the dwelling which shelters him. Everything about him is primitive and unformed, but he is himself the result of the labor and the experience of 18 centuries. He wears the dress and he speaks the language of cities. He is acquainted with the past, curious of the future, and ready for argument upon the present. He is, in short, a highly civilized being, who consents, for a time, to inhabit the backwoods, and who penetrates into the wilds of the New World with a Bible, an axe, and a file of newspapers. It is difficult to imagine the incredible rapidity with which public opinion circulates in the midst of these deserts. I do not think that so much intellectual intercourse takes place in the most enlightened and populous districts of France. It cannot be doubted that, in the United States, the instruction of the people powerfully contributes to the support of a democratic republic; and such must always be the case, I believe, where instruction which awakens the understanding is not separated from moral education which amends the heart. But I by no means exaggerate this benefit, and I am still further from thinking, as so many people do think in Europe, that men can be instantaneously made citizens by teaching them to read and write. True information is mainly derived from experience; and, if the Americans had not been gradually accustomed to govern themselves, their book learning would not assist them much at the present day. I have lived a great deal with the people in the United States, and I cannot express how much I admire their experience and their good sense. An American should never be allowed to speak of Europe, for he will then probably display a vast deal of presumption and very foolish pride. He will take up with those crude and vague notions which are so useful to the ignorant all over the world. But if you question him respecting his own country, the cloud which dimmed his intelligence will immediately disperse; his language will become as clear and as precise as his thoughts. He will inform you what his rights are, and by what means he exercises them. He will be able to point out the customs which obtain in the political world. You will find that he is well acquainted with the rules of the administration, and that he is familiar with the mechanism of the laws. The citizen of the United States does not acquire his practical science and his positive notions from books. The instruction he has acquired may have prepared him for receiving those ideas, but it did not furnish them. The American learns to know the laws by participating in the act of legislation, and he takes a lesson in the forms of government from governing. The great work of society is ever going on beneath his eyes, and, as it were, under his hands. In the United States, politics are the end and aim of education. In Europe, its principal object is to fit men for private life. The interference of the citizens in public affairs is too rare an occurrence for it to be anticipated beforehand. Upon casting a glance over society in the two hemispheres, these differences are indicated even by its external aspect. In Europe we frequently introduce the ideas and the habits of private life into public affairs, and as we pass at once from the domestic circle to the government of the state, we may frequently be heard to discuss the great interests of society in the same manner in which we converse with our friends. The Americans, on the other hand, transfuse the habits of public life into their manners in private, and in their country the jury is introduced into the games of schoolboys, and parliamentary forms are observed in the order of a feast. End of Chapter 17, Part 3.
Chapter 17, Principal Causes Maintaining the Democratic Republic, Part 4. The laws contribute more to the maintenance of the democratic republic in the United States than the physical circumstances of the country, and the manners more than the laws. All the nations of America have a democratic state of society, yet democratic institutions only subsist amongst the Anglo-Americans. The Spaniards of South America, equally favored by physical causes as the Anglo-Americans, unable to maintain a democratic republic. Mexico, which has adopted the Constitution of the United States, in the same predicament. The Anglo-Americans of the West less able to maintain it than those of the East. Reason of these different results. I have remarked that the maintenance of democratic institutions in the United States is attributable to the circumstances, the laws, and the manners of that country. Most Europeans are only acquainted with the first of these three causes, and they are apt to give it a preponderating importance which it does not really possess. It is true that the Anglo-Saxons settled in the New World in a state of social equality. The low-born and the noble were not to be found amongst them, and professional prejudices were always as entirely unknown as the prejudices of birth. Thus, as the condition of society was democratic, the empire of democracy was established without difficulty. But this circumstance is by no means peculiar to the United States. Almost all the transatlantic colonies were founded by men equal amongst themselves, or who became so by inhabiting them. In no one part of the New World have Europeans been able to create an aristocracy. Nevertheless, democratic institutions prosper nowhere but in the United States. The American Union has no enemies to contend with. It stands in the wilds like an island in the ocean. But the Spaniards of South America were no less isolated by nature, yet their position has not relieved them from the charge of standing armies. They make war upon each other when they have no foreign enemies to oppose, and the Anglo-American democracy is the only one which has hitherto been able to maintain itself in peace. The territory of the Union presents a boundless field to human activity, and inexhaustible materials for industry and labor. The passion of wealth takes the place of ambition, and the warmth of faction is mitigated by a sense of prosperity. But in what portion of the globe shall we meet with more fertile plains, with mightier rivers, or with more unexplored and inexhaustible riches than in South America? Nevertheless, South America has been unable to maintain democratic institutions. If the welfare of nations depended on their being placed in a remote position, with an unbounded space of habitable territory before them, the Spaniards of South America would have no reason to complain of their fate. And although they might enjoy less prosperity than the inhabitants of the United States, their lot might still be such as to excite the envy of some nations in Europe. There are, however, no nations upon the face of the earth more miserable than those of South America. Thus, not only are physical causes inadequate to produce results analogous to those which occur in North America, but they are unable to raise the population of South America above the level of European states, where they act in a contrary direction. Physical causes do not, therefore, affect the destiny of nations so much as has been supposed. I have met with men in New England who are on the point of leaving a country, where they might have remained in easy circumstances, to go to seek their fortune in the wilds. Not far from the district I found a French population in Canada, which was closely crowded on a narrow territory, although the same wilds were at hand, and whilst the emigrant from the United States purchased an extensive estate with the earnings of a short term of labor, the Canadian paid as much for land as he would have done in France. Nature offers the solitudes of the New World to Europeans, but they are not always acquainted with the means of turning her gifts to account. Other peoples of America have the same physical conditions of prosperity as the Anglo-Americans, but without their laws and their manners, and these people are wretched. The laws and manners of the Anglo-Americans are therefore that efficient cause of their greatness which is the object of my inquiry. I am far from supposing that the American laws are preeminently good in themselves. I do not hold them to be applicable to all democratic peoples, and several of them seem to be dangerous, even in the United States. Nevertheless, it cannot be denied that the American legislation, taken collectively, is extremely well adapted to the genius of the people and the nature of the country which it is intended to govern. The American laws are therefore good, and to them must be attributed a large portion of the success which attends the government of democracy in America. But I do not believe them to be the principal cause of that success, and if they seem to me to have more influence upon the social happiness of the Americans than the nature of the country, on the other hand there is reason to believe that their effect is still inferior to that produced by the manners of the people. The federal laws undoubtedly constitute the most important part of the legislation of the United States. Mexico, which is not less fortunately situated than the Anglo-American Union, has adopted the same laws, but is unable to accustom itself to the government of democracy. Some other cause is therefore at work, independently of those physical circumstances and peculiar laws which enable the democracy to rule in the United States. Another still more striking proof may be adduced. Almost all the inhabitants of the territory of the Union are the descendants of a common stock. They speak the same language, they worship God in the same manner, they are affected by the same physical causes, and they obey the same laws. Whence, then, do their characteristic differences arise? Why, in the eastern states of the Union, does the republican government display vigor and regularity, and proceed with mature deliberation? Whence does it derive the wisdom and the durability which marks its acts? Whilst in the western states, on the contrary, society seems to be ruled by the powers of chance. There, public business is conducted with an irregularity and a passionate and feverish excitement which does not announce a long or sure duration. I am no longer comparing the Anglo-American states to foreign nations, but I am contrasting them with each other and endeavoring to discover why they are so unlike. The arguments which are derived from the nature of the country and the difference of legislation are here all set aside. Recourse must be had to some other cause, and what other cause can there be except the manners of the people? It is in the Eastern States that the Anglo-Americans have been longest accustomed to the government of democracy, and that they have adopted the habits and conceived the notions most favorable to its maintenance. Democracy has gradually penetrated into their customs, their opinions, and the forms of social intercourse. It is to be found in all the details of daily life equally as in the laws. In the Eastern States the instruction and practical education of the people have been most perfected, and religion has been most thoroughly amalgamated with liberty. Now these habits, opinions, customs, and convictions are precisely the constituent elements of that which I have denominated manners. In the Western States, on the contrary, a portion of the same advantages is still wanting. Many of the Americans of the West were born in the woods, and they mix the ideas and the customs of savage life with the civilization of their parents. Their passions are more intense, their religious morality less authoritative, and their convictions less secure. The inhabitants exercise no sort of control over their fellow citizens, for they are scarcely acquainted with each other. The nations of the West display, to a certain extent, the inexperience and the rude habits of a people in its infancy, for although they are composed of old elements, their assemblage is of recent date. The manners of the Americans of the United States are, then, the real cause which renders that people the only one of the American nations that is able to support a democratic government. And it is the influence of manners which produces the different degrees of order and of prosperity that may be distinguished in the several Anglo-American democracies. Thus the effect which the geographical position of a country may have upon the duration of democratic institutions is exaggerated in Europe. Too much importance is attributed to legislation, too little to manners. These three great causes serve, no doubt, to regulate and direct the American democracy. But if they were to be classed in their proper order, I should say that the physical circumstances are less efficient than the laws, and the laws very subordinate to the manners of the people. I am convinced that the most advantageous situation and the best possible laws cannot maintain a constitution in spite of the manners of a country, whilst the latter may turn the most unfavorable positions and the worst laws to some advantage. The importance of manners is a common truth to which study and experience incessantly direct our attention. It may be regarded as a central point in the range of human observation, and the common termination of all inquiry. So seriously do I insist upon this head, that if I have hitherto failed in making the reader feel the important influence which I attribute to the practical experience, the habits, the opinions, in short, to the manners of the Americans, upon the maintenance of their institutions, I have failed in the principal object of my work. Whether laws and manners are sufficient to maintain democratic institutions in other countries besides America. The Anglo-Americans, if transported into Europe, would be obliged to modify their laws. Distinction to be made between democratic institutions and American institutions. Democratic laws may be conceived better than, or at least different from, those which the American democracy has adopted. The example of America only proves that it is possible to regulate democracy by the assistance of manners and legislation. I have asserted that the success of democratic institutions in the United States is more intimately connected with the laws themselves and the manners of the people than with the nature of the country. But does it follow that the same causes would of themselves produce the same results if they were put into operation elsewhere, and if the country is no adequate substitute for laws and manners, can laws and manners in their turn prove a substitute for the country? It will readily be understood that the necessary elements of a reply to this question are wanting. Other peoples are to be found in the New Worlds besides the Anglo-Americans, and as these people are affected by the same physical circumstances as the latter, they may fairly be compared together. But there are no nations out of America which have adopted the same laws and manners, being destitute of the physical advantages peculiar to the Anglo-Americans. No standard of comparison therefore exists, and we can only hazard an opinion upon this subject. It appears to me, in the first place, that a careful distinction must be made between the institutions of the United States and democratic institutions in general. When I reflect upon the state of Europe, its mighty nations, its populous cities, its formidable armies, and the complex nature of its politics, I cannot suppose that even the Anglo-Americans, if they were transported to our hemisphere with their ideas, their religion, and their manners, could exist without considerably altering their laws. But the democratic nation may be imagined, organized differently from the American people. It is not impossible to conceive a government really established upon the will of the majority, but in which the majority, repressing its natural propensity to equality, should consent, with a view to the order and the stability of the state, to invest a family or an individual with all the prerogatives of the executive. A democratic society might exist, in which the forces of the nation would be more centralized than they are in the United States. The people would exercise a less direct and less irresistible influence upon public affairs, and yet every citizen invested with certain rights would participate, within his sphere, in the conduct of the government. The observations I made amongst the Anglo-Americans induced me to believe that democratic institutions of this kind, prudently introduced into society, so as gradually to mix with the habits and to be interfused with the opinions of the people, might subsist in other countries besides America. If the laws of the United States were the only imaginable democratic laws, or the most perfect which it is possible to conceive, I should admit that the success of those institutions affords no proof of the success of the democratic institutions in general in a country less favored by natural circumstances. But as the laws of America appear to me to be defective in several respects, and as I can readily imagine others of the same general nature, the peculiar advantages of that country do not prove that democratic institutions cannot succeed in a nation less favored by circumstances if ruled by better laws. If human nature were different in America from what it is elsewhere, or if the social condition of the Americans engendered habits and opinions amongst them different from those which originate in the same social condition in the Old World, the American democracies would afford no means of predicting what may occur in other democracies. If the Americans displayed the same propensities as all other democratic nations, and if their legislators had relied upon the nature of the country and the favor of circumstances to restrain those propensities within due limits, the prosperity of the United States would be exclusively attributable to physical causes, and it would afford no encouragement to a people inclined to imitate their example without sharing their natural advantages. But neither of these suppositions is borne out by facts. In America the same passions are to be met with as in Europe, some originating in human nature, others in the democratic condition of society. Thus in the United States I found that restlessness of heart which is natural to men, when all ranks are nearly equal and the chances of elevation are the same to all. I found the democratic feeling of envy expressed under 1,000 different forms. I remarked that the people frequently displayed, in the conduct of affairs, a consummate mixture of ignorance and presumption, and I inferred that in America men are liable to the same failings and the same absurdities as amongst ourselves. But upon examining the state of society more attentively, I speedily discovered that the Americans had made great and successful efforts to counteract these imperfections of human nature, and to correct the natural defects of democracy. Their diverse municipal laws appeared to me to be a means of restraining the ambition of the citizens within a narrow sphere, and of turning those same passions which might have wreaked havoc in the state to the good of the township or the parish. The American legislators have succeeded to a certain extent in opposing the notion of rights to the feelings of envy, the permanence of the religious world to the continual shifting of politics, the experience of the people to its theoretical ignorance, and its practical knowledge of business to the impatience of its desires. The Americans then have not relied upon the nature of their country to counterpoise those dangers which originate in their constitution and in their political laws. To evils which are common to all democratic peoples they have applied remedies which none but themselves had ever thought of before. The manners and laws of the Americans are not the only ones which may suit a democratic people, but the Americans have shown that it would be wrong to despair of regulating democracy by the aid of manners and of laws. If other nations should borrow this general and pregnant idea from the Americans, without however intending to imitate them in the peculiar application which they have made of it, if they should attempt to fit themselves for that social condition, which it seems to be the will of Providence to impose upon the generations of this age, and so to escape from the despotism or the anarchy which threatens them, what reason is there to suppose that their efforts would not be crowned with success? The organization and the establishment of democracy in Christendom is the great political problem of the time. The Americans unquestionably have not resolved this problem, but they furnish useful data to those who undertake the task. Importance of what precedes with respect to the state of Europe. It may readily be discovered with what intention I undertook the foregoing inquiries. The question here discussed is interesting not only to the United States, but to the whole world. It concerns not a nation, but all mankind. If those nations whose social condition is democratic could only remain free as long as they are inhabitants of the wilds, we could not but despair of the future destiny of the human race. For democracy is rapidly acquiring a more extended sway, and the wilds are gradually peopled with men. If it were true that laws and manners are insufficient to maintain democratic institutions, what refuge would remain open to the nations except the despotism of a single individual? I am aware that there are many worthy persons at the present time who are not alarmed at this latter alternative, and who are so tired of liberty as to be glad of repose, far from those storms by which it is attended. But these individuals are ill acquainted with the haven towards which they are bound. They are so deluded by their recollections as to judge the tendency of absolute power by what it was formerly, and not by what it might become at the present time. If absolute power were re-established amongst the democratic nations of Europe, I am persuaded that it would assume a new form, and appear under features unknown to our forefathers. There was a time in Europe when the laws and the consent of the people had invested princes with almost unlimited authority, but they had scarcely ever availed themselves of it. I do not speak of the prerogatives of the nobility, of the authority of supreme courts of justice, of corporations and their chartered rights, or of the provincial privileges, which serve to break the blows of the sovereign authority, and to maintain a spirit of resistance in the nation. Independently of these political institutions, which, however opposed they might be to personal liberty, served to keep alive the love of freedom in the mind of the public, and which may be esteemed to have been useful in this respect, the manners and opinions of the nation confined the royal authority within barriers which were not less powerful, although they were less conspicuous. Religion, the affections of the people, the benevolence of the princes, the sense of honor, family pride, provincial prejudices, custom, and public opinion limited the power of kings, and restrained their authority within an invisible circle. The constitution of nations was despotic at that time, but their manners were free. Princes had the right, but they had neither the means nor the desire of doing whatever they pleased. But what now remains of those barriers which formerly arrested the aggressions of tyranny? Since religion has lost its empire over the souls of men, the most prominent boundary which divided good from evil is overthrown. The very elements of the moral world are indeterminate. The princes and the people of the earth are guided by chance, and none can define the natural limits of despotism and the bounds of license. Long revolutions have forever destroyed the respect which surrounded the rulers of the state, and since they have been relieved from the burden of public esteem, princes may henceforward surrender themselves without fear to the seductions of arbitrary power. When kings find that the hearts of their subjects are turned towards them, they are clement, because they are conscious of their strength, and they are chary of the affection of their people, because the affection of their people is the bulwark of the throne. A mutual interchange of goodwill then takes place between the prince and the people, which resembles the gracious intercourse of domestic society. The subjects may murmur at the sovereign's decree, but they are grieved to displease him, and the sovereign chastises his subject with the light hand of parental affection. But when once the spell of royalty is broken in the tumult of revolution, when successive monarchs have crossed the throne, so as alternately to display to the people the weakness of their right and the harshness of their power, the sovereign is no longer regarded by any as the father of the state, and he is feared by all as its master. If he be weak, he is despised. If he be strong, he is detested. He himself is full of animosity and alarm. He finds that he is as a stranger in his own country, and he treats his subjects like conquered enemies. When the provinces and the towns formed so many different nations in the midst of their common country, each of them had a will of their own, which was opposed to the general spirit of subjection. But now that all parts of the same empire, after having lost their immunities, their customs, their prejudices, their traditions, and their names, are subjected and accustomed to the same laws, it is not more difficult to oppress them collectively than it was formerly to oppress them singly. Whilst the nobles enjoyed their power, and indeed long after that power was lost, the honor of aristocracy conferred an extraordinary degree of force upon their personal opposition. They afford instances of men who, notwithstanding their weakness, still entertained a high opinion of their personal value, and dared to cope single-handed with the efforts of the public authority. But at the present day, when all ranks are more and more confounded, when the individual disappears in the throng, and is easily lost in the midst of a common obscurity, when the honor of monarchy has almost lost its empire without being succeeded by public virtue, and when nothing can enable man to rise above himself, who shall say at what point the exigencies of power and the servility of weakness will stop? As long as the family feeling was kept alive, the antagonist of oppression was never alone. He looked about him and found his clients, his hereditary friends, and his kinsfolk. If this support was wanting, he was sustained by his ancestors, and animated by his posterity. But when patrimonial estates are divided, and when a few years suffice to confound the distinctions of a race, where can family feeling be found? What force can there be in the customs of a country which has changed and is still perpetually changing in its aspect, in which every act of tyranny has a precedent, and every crime an example, in which there is nothing so old that its antiquity can save it from destruction, and nothing so unparalleled that its novelty can prevent it from being done? What resistance can be offered by manners of so pliant a make that they have already often yielded? What strength can even public opinion have retained when no 20 persons are connected by a common tie, when not a man, nor a family, nor chartered corporation, nor class, nor free institution, has the power of representing or exerting that opinion, and when every citizen, being equally weak, equally poor, and equally dependent, has only his personal impotence to oppose to the organized force of the government? The annals of France furnish nothing analogous to the condition in which that country might then be thrown, but it may more aptly be assimilated to the times of old, and to those hideous eras of Roman oppression, when the manners of the people were corrupted, their traditions obliterated, their habits destroyed, their opinions shaken, and freedom, expelled from the laws, could find no refuge in the land, when nothing protected the citizens, and the citizens no longer protected themselves. There was the sport of man, and princes wearied out the clemency of heaven before they exhausted the patience of their subjects. Those who hope to revive the monarchy of Henry IV. Or of Louis XIV. Appear to me to be afflicted with mental blindness, and when I consider the present condition of several European nations, a condition to which all the others tend, I am led to believe that they will soon be left with no other alternative than democratic liberty or the tyranny of the Caesars. And indeed it is deserving of consideration whether men are to be entirely emancipated or entirely enslaved, whether their rights are to be made equal or wholly taken away from them. If the rulers of society were reduced either gradually to raise the crowd to their own level, or to sink the citizens below that of humanity, would not the doubts of many be resolved, the consciences of many be healed, and the community prepared to make great sacrifices with little difficulty? In that case the gradual growth of democratic manners and institutions should be regarded, not as the best, but as the only means of preserving freedom, and without liking the government of democracy, it might be adopted as the most applicable and the fairest remedy for the present ills of society. It is difficult to associate a people in the work of government, but it is still more difficult to supply it with experience, and to inspire it with the feelings which it requires in order to govern well. I grant that the caprices of democracy are perpetual, its instruments are rude, its laws imperfect. But if it were true that soon no just medium would exist between the empire of democracy and the dominion of a single arm, should we not rather incline towards the former than submit voluntarily to the latter? If complete equality be our fate, is it not better to be leveled by free institutions than by despotic power? Those who, after having read this book, should imagine that my intention in writing it has been to propose the laws and manners of the Anglo-Americans for the imitation of all democratic peoples, would commit a very great mistake. They must have paid more attention to the form than to the substance of my ideas. My aim has been to show, by the example of America, that laws, and especially manners, may exist which will allow a democratic people to remain free. But I am very far from thinking that we ought to follow the example of the American democracy, and copy the means which it has employed to attain its ends, for I am well aware of the influence which the nature of a country and its political precedents exercise upon a constitution, and I should regard it as a great misfortune for mankind if liberty were to exist all over the world under the same forms. But I am of opinion that if we do not succeed in gradually introducing democratic institutions into France, and if we despair of imparting to the citizens those ideas and sentiments which first prepare them for freedom, and afterwards allow them to enjoy it, there will be no independence at all, either for the middling classes or the nobility, for the poor or for the rich, but an equal tyranny over all. And I foresee that if the peaceable empire of the majority be not founded amongst us in time, we shall sooner or later arrive at the unlimited authority of a single despot. End of Chapter 17. Principal Causes Maintaining the Democratic Republic, Part 4.
Chapter 18, The Future Condition of Three Races in the United States, Part 1. The present and probable future condition of the three races which inhabit the territory of the United States. The principal part of the task which I had imposed upon myself is now performed. I have shown, as far as I was able, the laws and the manners of the American democracy. Here I might stop, but the reader would perhaps feel that I had not satisfied his expectations. The absolute supremacy of democracy is not all that we meet with in America. The inhabitants of the New World may be considered from more than one point of view. In the course of this work, my subject has often led me to speak of the Indians and the Negroes, but I have never been able to stop in order to show what place these two races occupy in the midst of the democratic people whom I was engaged in describing. I have mentioned in what spirit and according to what laws the Anglo-American Union was formed, but I could only glance at the dangers which menaced that confederation, whilst it was equally impossible for me to give a detailed account of its chances of duration independently of its laws and manners. When speaking of the United Republican States, I hazarded no conjectures upon the permanence of republican forms in the New World, and when making frequent allusions to the commercial activity which reigns in the Union, I was unable to inquire into the future condition of the Americans as a commercial people. These topics are collaterally connected with my subject without forming a part of it. They are American without being democratic, and to portray democracy has been my principal aim. It was therefore necessary to postpone these questions, which I now take up as the proper termination of my work. The territory now occupied or claimed by the American Union spreads from the shores of the Atlantic to those of the Pacific Ocean. On the east and west, its limits are those of the continent itself. On the south it advances nearly to the tropic, and it extends upward to the icy regions of the north. The human beings who are scattered over this place do not form, as in Europe, so many branches of the same stock. Three races, naturally distinct, and I might almost say hostile to each other, are discoverable amongst them at first glance. Almost insurmountable barriers have been raised between them by education and by law, as well as by their origin and outward characteristics. But fortune has brought them together on the same soil, where although they are mixed, they do not amalgamate, and each race fulfills its destiny apart. Among these widely differing families of men, the first which attracts attention, the superior in intelligence, in power, and in enjoyment, is the white or European, the man preeminent, and in subordinate grades, the Negro and the Indian. These two unhappy races have nothing in common, neither birth, nor features, nor language, nor habits. Their only resemblance lies in their misfortunes. Both of them occupy an inferior rank in the country they inhabit. Both suffer from tyranny, and if their wrongs are not the same, they originate, at any rate, with the same authors. If we reason from what passes in the world, we should almost say that the European is to the other races of mankind what man is to the lower animals. He makes them subservient to his use, and when he cannot subdue, he destroys them. Oppression has, at one stroke, deprived the descendants of the Africans of almost all the privileges of humanity. The Negro of the United States has lost all remembrance of his country. The language which his forefathers spoke was never heard around him. He abjured their religion and forgot their customs when he ceased to belong to Africa, without acquiring any claim to European privileges. But he remains halfway between the two communities, sold by the one, repulsed by the other, finding not a spot in the universe to call by the name of country, except the faint image of a home which the shelter of his master's roof affords. The Negro has no family. Woman is merely the temporary companion of his pleasures, and his children are upon an equality with him from the moment of their birth. Am I to call it a proof of God's mercy, or a visitation of his wrath, that man in certain states appears to be insensible to his extreme wretchedness, and almost affects with a depraved taste the cause of his misfortunes? The Negro who is plunged in this abyss of evil scarcely feels his own calamitous situation. Violence made him a slave, and the habit of servitude gives him the thoughts and desires of a slave. He admires his tyrants more than he hates them, and finds his joy and his pride in the servile imitation of those who oppress him. His understanding is degraded to the level of his soul. The Negro enters upon slavery as soon as he is born. Nay, he may have been purchased in the womb, and have begun his slavery before he began his existence. Equally devoid of wants and of enjoyment, and useless to himself, he learns with his first notions of existence that he is the property of another who has an interest in preserving his life, and that the care of it does not devolve upon himself. Even the power of thought appears to him a useless gift of Providence, and he quietly enjoys the privileges of his debasement. If he becomes free, independence is often felt by him to be a heavier burden than slavery, for having learned in the course of his life to submit to everything except reason, he is too much unacquainted with her dictates to obey them. 1,000 new desires beset him, and he is destitute of the knowledge and energy necessary to resist them. These are masters which it is necessary to contend with, and he has learnt only to submit and obey. In short, he sinks to such a depth of wretchedness, that while servitude brutalizes, liberty destroys him. Oppression has been no less fatal to the Indian than to the Negro race, but its effects are different. Before the arrival of white men in the New World, the inhabitants of North America lived quietly in their woods, enduring the vicissitudes and practising the virtues and vices common to savage nations. The Europeans, having dispersed the Indian tribes and driven them into the deserts, condemned them to a wandering life full of inexpressible sufferings. Savage nations are only controlled by opinion and by custom. When the North American Indians had lost the sentiment of attachment to their country, when their families were dispersed, their traditions obscured, and the chain of their recollections broken, when all their habits were changed, and their wants increased beyond measure, European tyranny rendered them more disorderly and less civilized than they were before. The moral and physical condition of these tribes continually grew worse, and they became more barbarous as they became more wretched. Nevertheless, the Europeans have not been able to metamorphose the character of the Indians, and though they have power to destroy them, they have never been able to make them submit to the rules of civilized society. The lot of the Negro is placed on the extreme limit of servitude, while that of the Indian lies on the utmost verge of liberty, and slavery does not produce more fatal effects upon the first than independence upon the second. The Negro has lost all property in his own person, and he cannot dispose of his existence without committing a sort of fraud, but the savage is his own master as soon as he is able to act. Parental authority is scarcely known to him. He has never bent his will to that of any of his kind, nor learned the difference between voluntary obedience and a shameful subjection, and the very name of law is unknown to him. To be free with him signifies to escape from all the shackles of society. As he delights in this barbarous independence, and would rather perish than sacrifice the least of it, civilization has little power over him. The Negro makes 1,000 fruitless efforts to insinuate himself amongst men who repulse him. He conforms to the taste of his oppressors, adopts their opinions, and hopes by imitating them to form a part of their community. Having been told from infancy that his race is naturally inferior to that of the whites, he assents to the proposition and is ashamed of his own nature. In each of his features he discovers a trace of slavery, and if it were in his power he would willingly rid himself of everything that makes him what he is. The Indian, on the contrary, has his imagination inflated with the pretended nobility of his origin, and lives and dies in the midst of these dreams of pride. Far from desiring to conform his habits to ours, he loves his savage life as the distinguishing mark of his race, and he repels every advance to civilization, less perhaps from the hatred which he entertains for it than from a dread of resembling the Europeans. While he has nothing to oppose to our perfections in arts but the resources of the desert, to our tactics nothing but undisciplined courage, whilst our well-digested plans are met by the spontaneous instincts of savage life, who can wonder if he fails in this unequal contest? The Negro, who earnestly desires to mingle his race with that of the European, cannot effect it, while the Indian, who might succeed to a certain extent, disdains to make the attempt. The servility of one dooms him to slavery, the pride of the other to death. I remember that while I was travelling through the forests which still cover the state of Alabama, I arrived one day at the log house of a pioneer. I did not wish to penetrate into the dwelling of the American, but retired to rest myself for a while on the margin of a spring, which was not far off in the woods. While I was in this place, which was in the neighbourhood of the Creek territory, an Indian woman appeared, followed by a negress, and holding by the hand a little white girl of 5 or 6 years old, whom I took to be the daughter of the pioneer. A sort of barbarous luxury set off the costume of the Indian. Rings of metal were hanging from her nostrils and ears. Her hair was adorned with glass beads, fell loosely upon her shoulders, and I saw that she was not married, for she still wore that necklace of shells which the bride always deposits on the nuptial couch. The negress was clad in squalid European garments. They all three came and seated themselves upon the banks of the fountain, and the young Indian, taking the child in her arms, lavished upon her such fond caresses as mothers give, while the negress endeavoured, by various little artifices, to attract the attention of the young Creole. The child displayed in her slightest gestures a consciousness of superiority, which formed a strange contrast with her infantine weakness, as if she received the attention of her companions with a sort of condescension. The negress was seated on the ground before her mistress, watching her smallest desires, and apparently divided between strong affection for the child and servile fear, whilst the savage displayed in the midst of her tenderness an air of freedom and of pride which was almost ferocious. I had approached the group, and I contemplated them in silence, but my curiosity was probably displeasing to the Indian woman, for she suddenly rose, pushed the child roughly from her, and giving me an angry look, plunged into the thicket. I had often chanced to see individuals met together in the same place, who belonged to the three races of men which people North America. I had perceived from many different results the preponderance of the whites, but in the picture which I have just been describing there was something peculiarly touching. A bond of affection here united the oppressors with the oppressed, and the effort of nature to bring them together rendered still more striking the immense distance placed between them by prejudice and by law. The present and probable future condition of the Indian tribes which inhabit the territory possessed by the Union. Gradual disappearance of the native tribes, manner in which it takes place, miseries accompanying the forced migrations of the Indians. The savages of North America had only two ways of escaping destruction: war or civilization. They are no longer able to make war. Reasons why they refused to become civilized when it was in their power, and why they cannot become so now that they desire it. Instance of the Creeks and Cherokees. Policy of the particular states towards these Indians. Policy of the federal government. None of the Indian tribes which have formerly inhabited the territory of New England, the Narragansetts, the Mohicans, the Pequots, have any existence but in the recollection of man. The Lenaps, who received William Penn 150 years ago upon the banks of the Delaware, have disappeared, and I myself met with the last of the Iroquois, who were begging alms. The nations I have mentioned formerly covered the county to the sea coast, but a traveller at the present day must penetrate more than 100 leagues into the interior of the continent to find an Indian. Not only have these wild tribes receded, but they are destroyed, and as they give way or perish, an immense and increasing people fills their place. There is no instance upon record of so prodigious a growth or so rapid a destruction. The manner in which the latter change takes place is not difficult to describe. When the Indians were the sole inhabitants of the wilds from whence they have since been expelled, their wants were few. Their arms were of their own manufacture, their only drink was the water of the brook, and their clothes consisted of the skins of animals whose flesh furnished them with food. The Europeans introduced amongst the savages of North America firearms, ardent spirits, and iron. They taught them to exchange for manufactured stuffs the rough garments which had previously satisfied their untutored simplicity. Having acquired new taste, without the arts by which they could be gratified, the Indians were obliged to have recourse to the workmanship of the whites, but in return for their productions the savage had nothing to offer except the rich furs which still abounded in his woods. Hence the chase became necessary, not merely to provide for his subsistence, but in order to procure the only objects of barter which he could furnish to Europe. Whilst the wants of the natives were thus increasing, their resources continued to diminish. The Indians will not live as Europeans live, and yet they can neither subsist without them, nor exactly after the fashion of their fathers. This is demonstrated by a fact which I likewise give upon official authority. Some Indians of a tribe on the banks of Lake Superior had killed a European. The American government interdicted all traffic with the tribe to which the guilty parties belonged until they were delivered up to justice. This measure had the desired effect. From the moment when a European settlement is formed in the neighbourhood of the territory occupied by the Indians, the beasts of chase take the alarm. Thousands of savages wandering in the forests and destitute of any fixed dwelling did not disturb them, but as soon as the continuous sounds of European labour are heard in their neighbourhood, they begin to flee away and retire to the west, where their instinct teaches them that they will find deserts of immeasurable extent. The buffalo is constantly receding, say Messrs. Clark and Cass in their report of the year 1829. A few years since they approached the base of the Alleghany, and a few years hence they may even be rare upon the immense plains which extend to the base of the Rocky Mountains. I have been assured that this effect of the approach of the whites is often felt at 200 leagues distance from their frontier. Their influence is thus exerted over tribes whose name is unknown to them, and who suffer the evils of usurpation long before they are acquainted with the authors of their distress. Bold adventurers soon penetrate into the country the Indians have deserted, and when they have advanced about 15 or 20 leagues from the extreme frontiers of the whites, they begin to build habitations for civilized beings in the midst of the wilderness. This is done without difficulty, as the territory of a hunting nation is ill defined. It is the common property of the tribe, and belongs to no one in particular, so that individual interests are not concerned in the protection of any part. A few European families settled in different situations at a considerable distance from each other soon drive away the wild animals which remained between their places of abode. The Indians, who had previously lived in a sort of abundance, then find it difficult to subsist, and still more difficult to procure the articles of barter which they stand in need of. To drive away their game is to deprive them of the means of existence, as effectually as if the fields of our agriculturists were stricken with barrenness, and they are reduced, like famished wolves, to prowl through the forsaken woods in quest of prey. Their instinctive love of their country attaches them to the soil which gave them birth, even after it has ceased to yield anything but misery and death. At length they are compelled to acquiesce, and to depart they follow the traces of the elk, the buffalo, and the beaver, and are guided by these wild animals in the choice of their future country. Properly speaking, therefore, it is not the Europeans who drive away the native inhabitants of America, it is famine which compels them to recede, a happy distinction which had escaped the causes of former times, and for which we are indebted to modern discovery. The ejectment of the Indians very often takes place at the present day in a regular and, as it were, legal manner. When the European population begins to approach the limit of the desert inhabited by a savage tribe, the government of the United States usually dispatches envoys to them, who assemble the Indians in a large plain, and having first eaten and drunk with them, accost them in the following manner: "What have you to do in the land of your fathers? Before long you must dig up their bones in order to live. In what respect is the country you inhabit better than another? Are there no woods, marshes, or prairies except where you dwell? And can you live nowhere but under your own sun? Beyond those mountains which you see at the horizon, beyond the lake which bounds your territory in the west, there lie vast countries where beasts of chase are found in great abundance. Sell your lands to us, and go to live happily in these solitudes." After holding this language, they spread before the eyes of the Indians firearms, woolen garments, kegs of brandy, glass necklaces, bracelets of tinsel, earrings, and looking-glasses. If, when they have beheld all these riches, they still hesitate, it is insinuated that they have not the means of refusing their required consent, and that the government itself will not long have the power of protecting them in their rights. What are they to do? Half convinced and half compelled, they go to inhabit new deserts, where the importunate whites will not let them remain 10 years in tranquillity. In this manner the Americans obtain, at a very low price, whole provinces, which the riches of Europe could not purchase. The Indians, says the report, reached the treaty ground poor and almost naked. Large quantities of goods are taken there by the traders, and are seen and examined by the Indians. The women and children become importunate to have their wants supplied, and their influence is soon exerted to induce a sale. Their improvidence is habitual and unconquerable. The gratification of his immediate wants and desires is the ruling passion of an Indian. The expectation of future advantages seldom produces much effect. The experience of the past is lost, and the prospects of the future disregarded. It would be utterly hopeless to demand a cessation of land, unless the means were at hand of gratifying their immediate wants, and when their condition and circumstances are fairly considered, It ought not to surprise us that they are so anxious to relieve themselves. End of chapter 18 of Democracy in America by Alexis de Tocqueville. Chapter 18, Part 2, Future Condition of Three Races. These are great evils, and it must be added that they appear to me to be irremediable. I believe that the Indian nations of North America are doomed to perish, and that whenever the Europeans shall be established in the shores of the Pacific Ocean, that race of men will be no more. The Indian had only two alternatives of war or civilization. In other words, they must either have destroyed the Europeans or become their equals. At the first settlement of the colonies, they might have found it possible, by uniting their forces, to deliver themselves from the small bodies of strangers who landed on their continent. They several times attempted to do it, and were on the point of succeeding, but the disproportion of their resources at the present day, when compared with those of the whites, is too great to allow such an enterprise to be thought of. Nevertheless, there do arise from time to time among the Indian men of penetration, who foresee the final destiny which awaits the native population, and who exert themselves to unite all the tribes in common hostility to the Europeans, but their efforts are unavailing. Those tribes which are in the neighbourhood of the whites are too much weakened to offer an effectual resistance, whilst the others, giving way to that childish carelessness of the morrow which characterises savage life, wait for the near approach of danger before they prepare to meet it. Some are unable, the others are unwilling to exert themselves. It is easy to foresee that the Indians will never conform to civilization, or that it will be too late whenever they may be inclined to make the experiment. Civilization is the result of a long social process which takes place in the same spot and is handed down from one generation to another, each one profiting by the experience of the last. Of all nations, those submit to civilization with the most difficulty which habitually live by the chase. Pastoral tribes indeed often change their place of abode, but they follow a regular order in their migrations, and often return again to their old stations, whilst the dwelling of the hunter varies with that of the animal he pursues. Several attempts have been made to diffuse knowledge among the Indians without controlling their wandering propensities by the Jesuits in Canada and by the Puritans in New England, but none of these endeavours were crowned by any lasting success. Civilization began in the cabin, but it soon retired to expire in the woods. The great error of these legislators of the Indians was their not understanding that, in order to succeed in civilizing a people, it is first necessary to fix it, which cannot be done without inducing it to cultivate the soil. The Indians ought in the first place to have been accustomed to agriculture, but not only are they destitute of this indispensable preliminary to civilization, they would even have great difficulty in acquiring it. Men who have once abandoned themselves to the restless and adventurous life of the hunter feel an insurmountable disgust for the constant and regular labour which tillage requires. We see this proved in the bosom of our own society, but it is far more visible among people whose partiality for the chase is part of their national character. Independently of this general difficulty, there is another which applies peculiarly to the Indians. They consider labour not merely as an evil, but as a disgrace. So their pride prevents them from becoming civilized as much as their indolence. There is no Indian so wretched as not to retain under his hut of bark a lofty idea of his personal worth. He considers the cares of industry and labour as degrading occupations. He compares the husbandman to the ox which traces the furrow, and even in our most ingenious handicraft he can see nothing but the labour of slaves. Not that he is devoid of admiration for the power and intellectual greatness of the whites, but although the results of our efforts surprise him, he contemns the means by which we obtain it, and while he acknowledges our ascendancy, he still believes in his superiority. War and hunting are the only pursuits which appear to him worthy to be the occupations of a man. The Indian, in the dreary solitude of his woods, cherishes the same ideas, the same opinions as the noble of the Middle Ages in his castle, and he only requires to become a conqueror to complete the resemblance. Thus, however strange it may seem, it is in the forests of the New World, and not amongst the Europeans who people its coasts, that the ancient prejudices of Europe are still in existence. More than once in the course of this work I have endeavoured to explain the prodigious influence which the social condition appears to exercise upon the laws and the manners of men, and I beg to add a few words on the same subject. When I perceive the resemblance which exists between the political institutions of our ancestors the Germans and the wandering tribes of North America, between the customs described by Tacitus and those of which I have sometimes been a witness, I cannot help thinking that the same cause has brought the same results in both hemispheres, and that in the midst of the apparent diversity of human affairs, a certain number of primary facts may be discovered from which all the others are derived. In what we usually call the German institutions, then, I am inclined only to perceive barbarian habits, and the opinions of savages in what we style feudal principles. However strongly the vices and prejudices of the North American Indians may be opposed to their becoming agricultural and civilized, necessity sometimes obliges them to it. Several of the southern nations, and amongst others the Cherokees and the Creeks, were surrounded by Europeans who had landed on the shores of the Atlantic, and who either descending the Ohio or proceeding up the Mississippi arrived simultaneously upon their borders. These tribes have not been driven from place to place like their northern brethren, but they have been gradually enclosed within narrow limits, like the game within the thicket, before the huntsmen plunge into the interior. The Indians who were thus placed between civilization and death found themselves obliged to live by ignominious labour like the whites. They took to agriculture, and without entirely forsaking their old habits or manners, sacrificed only as much as was necessary to their existence. The Cherokees went further. They created a written language, established a permanent form of government, and as everything proceeds rapidly in the New World, before they had all of them closed, they set up a newspaper. The growth of European habits has been remarkably accelerated among these Indians by the mixed race which has sprung up. Deriving intelligence from their father's side, without entirely losing the savage custom of the mother, the half-blood forms the natural link between civilization and barbarism. Wherever this race has multiplied, the savage state has become modified, and a great change has taken place in the manners of the people. The success of the Cherokees proves that the Indians are capable of civilization, but it does not prove that they will succeed in it. This difficulty which the Indians find in submitting to civilization proceeds from the influence of a general cause which it is almost impossible for them to escape. An attentive survey of history demonstrates that, in general, barbarous nations have raised themselves to civilization by degrees, and by their own efforts. Whenever they derived knowledge from a foreign people, they stood towards it in the relation of conquerors, and not of a conquered nation. When the conquered nation is enlightened, and the conquerors are half savage, as in the case of the invasion of Rome by the northern nations, or that of China by the Mongols, the power which victory bestows upon the barbarian is sufficient to keep up his importance among civilized men, and permit him to rank as their equal until he becomes their rival. The one has might on his side, the other has intelligence. The former admires the knowledge and the arts of the conquered, the latter envies the power of the conquerors. The barbarians at length admit civilized men into their palaces, and he turns open his schools to the barbarians. But when the side on which the physical force lies also possesses an intellectual preponderance, the conquered party seldom becomes civilized. It retreats or is destroyed. It may therefore be said in a general way that savages go forth in arms to seek knowledge, but that they do not receive it when it comes to them. And to gain the bread which nourishes him by hard and ignoble labour, such are in his eyes the only results which civilization can boast, and even this much he is not sure to obtain. When the Indians undertake to imitate their European neighbours, and to till the earth like the settlers, they are immediately exposed to a very formidable competition. The white man is skilled in the craft of agriculture. The Indian is a rough beginner in an art with which he is unacquainted. The former reaps abundant crops without difficulty. The latter meets with 1,000 obstacles in raising the fruits of the earth. The European is placed amongst a population whose wants he knows and partakes. The savage is isolated in the midst of a hostile people, with whose manners, language, and laws he is imperfectly acquainted, but without whose assistance he cannot live. He can only procure the materials of comfort by bartering his commodities against the goods of the European, for the assistance of his countrymen is wholly insufficient to supply his wants. When the Indian wishes to sell the produce of his labour, he cannot always meet with a purchaser, whilst the European readily finds a market, and the former can only produce at a considerable cost that which the latter vends at a very low rate. Thus the Indian has no sooner escaped those evils to which barbarous nations are exposed, than he is subjected to the still greater miseries of civilized communities, and he finds it scarcely less difficult to live in the midst of our abundance than in the depths of his own wilderness. He has not yet lost the habits of his erratic life. The traditions of his fathers and his passion for the chase are still alive within him. The wild enjoyments which formerly animated him in the woods painfully excite his troubled imagination, and his former privations appear to be less keen, his former perils less appalling. He contrasts the independence which he possessed among his equals with the servile position which he occupies in civilized society. On the other hand, the solitudes which were so long his free home are still at hand. A few hours' march will bring them back to him once more. The whites offer him a sum, which seems to be considerable, for the ground which he has begun to clear. This money of the Europeans might possibly furnish him with the means of a happy and peaceful subsistence in remoter regions, and he quits the plough, resumes his native arms, and returns to the wilderness forever. The condition of the Creeks and the Cherokees, to which I have already alluded, sufficiently corroborates the truth of this deplorable picture. I myself saw in Canada, where the intellectual difference between the two races is less striking, that the English are the masters of commerce and manufacture in the Canadian country, that they spread on all sides, and confine the French within limits which scarcely suffice to contain them. In like manner, in Louisiana, almost all activity in commerce and manufacture centres in the hands of the Anglo-Americans. But the case of Texas is still more striking. The state of Texas is a part of Mexico, and lies upon the frontier between that country and the United States. In the course of the last few years, the Anglo-Americans have penetrated into this province, which is still thinly peopled. They purchase land, they produce the commodities of the country, and supplant the original population. It may easily be foreseen that if Mexico takes no steps to check this change, the province of Texas will very shortly cease to belong to that government. If the different degrees, comparatively so slight, which exist in European civilization produce results of such magnitude, the consequences which must ensue from the collision of the most perfect European civilization with Indian savages may readily be conceived. The Indians, in the little which they have done, have unquestionably displayed as much natural genius as the peoples of Europe in their most important designs, but nations as well as men require time to learn, whatever may be their intelligence and their zeal. Whilst the savages were engaged in the work of civilization, the Europeans continued to surround them on every side, and to confine them within narrower limits. The two races gradually met, and they are now in immediate juxtaposition to each other. The Indian is already superior to his barbarous parent, but he is still very far below his white neighbour. With their resources and acquired knowledge, the Europeans soon appropriated to themselves most of the advantages which the natives might have derived from the possession of the soil. They have settled on the country, they have purchased land at a very low rate, or have occupied it by force, and the Indians have been ruined by a competition which they had not the means of resisting. They were isolated in their own country, and their race only constituted a colony of troublesome aliens in the midst of a numerous and domineering people. Washington said in one of his messages to Congress, "We are more enlightened and more powerful than the Indian nations. We are therefore bound in honour to treat them with kindness and even with generosity." But this virtuous and high-minded policy has not been followed. The rapacity of the settlers is usually backed by the tyranny of the government. Although the Cherokees and the Creeks are established upon the territory which they inhabit before the settlement of the Europeans, and although the Americans have frequently treated with them as foreign nations, the surrounding states have not consented to acknowledge them as independent peoples, and attempts have been made to subject these children of the woods to Anglo-American magistrates, laws, and customs. Destitution had driven these unfortunate Indians to civilization, and oppression now drives them back to their former condition. Many of them abandon the soil which they had begun to clear, and return to their savage course of life. End of chapter 18, part 2.